Hey guys, tonight we're going to drift into the wonderfully twisted world of medieval justice, where rulers had the creativity of a Renaissance artist and the moral compass of a broken GPS. So dim those lights, get comfortable in your favorite spot, and let's explore how kings and queens throughout history turned punishment into an art form that would make modern horror writers weep with envy. Now, before we dive into this delightfully dark rabbit hole, grab your coziest blanket because we're going to be here for a while. Tonight's journey through medieval cruelty is going to be like a gentle stroll through a museum of human creativity, except every exhibit involves someone getting their limbs removed in increasingly inventive ways. But don't worry, we'll keep things nice and calm, just the way history should be told at bedtime. Medieval rulers, bless their power-hungry heart, had this fascinating approach to justice that basically boiled down to, how can I make this punishment so horrifically memorable that people will talk about it for centuries? And honestly, mission accomplished. Because here we are, hundreds of years later, still talking about their creative problem-solving skills. Let's start our journey with one of history's most enthusiastic practitioners of creative punishment, Vlad III of Wallachia, better known as Vlad the Impaler. Now, Vlad got his nickname not because he was really good at fence installation, but because he had this charming habit of, well, impaling people. And when I say people, I mean basically anyone who looked at him wrong on a Tuesday. Vlad ruled Wallachia in the 15th century, and he was dealing with Ottoman invasions, rebellious nobles, and probably some serious childhood trauma involving his father being called Vlad the Dragon, because nothing says I'm gonna grow up to be emotionally stable like having a dad, nicknamed after a fire-breathing mythical beast. But Vlad took impalement and turned it into performance art. He didn't just stick people on spikes and call it a day. Oh no, that would be far too simple for our creative prince. He would arrange thousands of impaled bodies in geometric patterns around his castle, creating what historians generously call forests of the impaled. Imagine coming home from a long day of medieval politicking and having to navigate through your front yard. Decoration of several thousand rotting corpses arranged in neat rows. The property values must have been terrible. The thing about Vlad's impaling technique was that it wasn't designed to kill quickly. That would defeat the entire psychological warfare aspect of the whole operation. The spike was carefully positioned to avoid vital organs, allowing the victim to live for hours or sometimes days while slowly sliding down the pole. It was medieval engineering meets performance art meets therapy session, because clearly Vlad had some things to work through, and the numbers involved were just staggering. Conservative estimates put Vlad's impaling hobby at around 80,000 people during his relatively short reign. That's like depopulating a small city, one spike at a time. The dedication to the craft is almost admirable if you ignore the whole mass murder aspect of it. But here's where it gets really weird. Vlad apparently enjoyed dining among his impaled victims. He would set up banquets right in the middle of his spike forests, presumably because nothing says fine dining experience like the aroma of decomposing enemies wafting over your medieval pasta course. There are accounts of him dipping bread in the blood of his victims while casually chatting with dinner guests. Because why let perfectly good blood go to waste, right? One particularly memorable incident involved some Ottoman envoys who refused to remove their turbans in Vlad's presence, claiming it was against their religious customs. Vlad, being the accommodating host that he was, decided to help them keep their turbans on permanently by nailing them to their heads. Problem solved with typical medieval efficiency. Now, while Vlad was busy redecorating Wallachia with human lawn ornaments, other medieval rulers were developing their own signature punishment styles. Take Ivan the Terrible of Russia, who got his nickname not because he was having a bad day, but because he spent most of his reign in what can only be described as a decades-long homicidal temper tantrum. Ivan had this wonderful invention called the oprichniki, which was basically his personal secret police force of black-clad horsemen who carried severed dog heads on their saddles. Because nothing says we're here to help, like decorating your horse with decomposing animal parts. These guys were given free rein to terrorize anyone Ivan suspected of disloyalty, which, given Ivan's paranoia levels, included pretty much everyone who had ever made eye contact with him. One of Ivan's more creative punishment methods involved something he called the frying pan. This wasn't your grandmother's kitchen cookware. This was a specially designed torture device that slowly roasted people alive. Ivan would have victims tied to a giant metal pan over a fire and then personally oversee the cooking process, because quality control was apparently very important to him. But Ivan's masterpiece of medieval justice was his treatment of the city of Novgorod in 1570, suspecting the city of treason, which in Ivan's mind probably meant someone there had sneezed without permission. He decided to make an example that would be remembered for centuries. He marched into Novgorod with his oprichniki and proceeded to systematically torture and execute somewhere between 2,000 and 15,000 people, depending on which historian you ask. The methods included drowning people under ice, roasting them alive, and his personal favorite, tying them to sleds and dragging them behind horses until they died. Ivan was particularly fond of what he called creative executions. He once had a treasurer boiled alive in a giant cauldron, presumably because someone miscounted the royal coins. Another unfortunate soul was tied to a barrel of gunpowder and blown up, because Ivan believed in keeping up with the latest in explosive technology. But perhaps the most tragically ironic moment in Ivan's reign was when he accidentally killed his own son and heir during one of his rage-induced beatings in 1581. Even by medieval standards, accidentally murdering your own succession plan was considered poor leadership technique. Ivan reportedly spent the rest of his life in deep remorse, which is touching, but probably didn't bring much comfort to the thousands of other people he had killed with considerably less regret. Speaking of family dysfunction, let's drift over to England and talk about Henry VIII, who turned marriage counseling into a contact sport. Henry is famous for having 6 wives, but what's less well known is his creative approach to dealing with people who annoyed him, which was basically everyone who wasn't actively agreeing with him at any given moment. Henry's signature punishment was, of course, beheading, but he elevated it to an art form. He didn't just chop off heads willy-nilly. He had specific beheading protocols, premium execution locations, and even imported a special French swordsman to ensure Anne Boleyn got the cleanest possible decapitation. Because nothing says, "I loved you once," like hiring a professional to make your divorce permanent with maximum efficiency. But Henry's real innovation was in the psychological torture department. Take the case of Thomas More, his former friend and chancellor, who had the audacity to disagree with Henry's whole "I'm starting my own church so I can divorce my wife" plan. Henry didn't just execute More, he kept him in the Tower of London for over a year, repeatedly offering him chances to save his life if he would just acknowledge Henry as the head of the English Church. More, being the principled sort of fellow who probably would have made a terrible politician in any era, refused every offer. So Henry had him beheaded, but not before making sure More understood exactly what he was giving up. It was psychological warfare with a medieval twist. Here's your choice: agree with me or lose your head. And also, I'm going to make you think about it for a really, really long time first. Henry also pioneered the concept of legislative murder. He would literally change the laws to make whatever he wanted to do to someone technically legal. When he decided he wanted to execute Catherine Howard, his fifth wife, for adultery, he first passed a law making it treason for a queen to fail to disclose her sexual history before marriage. Then he executed her under this brand new law he had just invented, specifically for her situation. It was like legal system speedrunning, medieval style. But perhaps Henry's most creative punishment was reserved for the Pilgrimage of Grace rebels in 1536. After promising them pardons if they dispersed peacefully, Henry waited for them to go home and then systematically hunted down and executed the leaders anyway. Because why honor your word when you can teach everyone a lesson about trusting royal promises? He had the rebel leaders hanged in their own villages, often using the church bells as makeshift gallows, which sent a pretty clear message about mixing religion and politics in Henry's England. The execution methods Henry employed weren't just about killing people, they were about making statements. When he executed the Carthusian monks who opposed his religious reforms, he had them hanged, drawn, and quartered, with their body parts displayed throughout London. One monk, John Houghton, reportedly remained conscious long enough to say, "Good Jesu, what will you do with my heart?" as the executioner was literally removing it from his chest. Even by medieval standards, that's impressive dedication to maintaining polite conversation during dismemberment. Now, while Henry was busy revolutionizing the divorce process through strategic beheading, other European rulers were developing their own approaches to creative justice. Let's float over to France and discuss the delightfully unhinged world of French medieval punishment, where they managed to make even execution an elaborate social event. French medieval justice had this wonderful concept called breaking on the wheel, which was exactly as pleasant as it sounds. The condemned would be tied to a large wheel and have their limbs systematically broken with iron bars, creating what medieval French society apparently considered quality entertainment. The whole process could take hours, and spectators would bring picnic lunches to enjoy during the show, because nothing enhances the flavor of medieval cheese quite like the sound of bones snapping rhythmically in the background. But the French really excelled at making punishment into performance art. Take the case of Damiens, who attempted to assassinate Louis XV in 1757. The French court decided that a simple execution wasn't nearly elaborate enough for someone who had dared to poke the king with a penknife. Instead, they developed what can only be described as the medieval equivalent of a Rube Goldberg machine of death. Damiens was subjected to what the French called drawing and quartering, but with some creative additions. First, they used red-hot pincers to tear chunks of flesh from his body. Then they poured molten lead, boiling oil, burning resin, and molten wax into his wounds. After that, they tied his limbs to 4 horses and tried to pull him apart, but his joints were apparently stronger than expected, so they had to use knives to help the horses along. The entire process took over 2 hours, and Damiens reportedly remained conscious and conversational for most of it, probably wishing he had just written a strongly worded letter instead. The French also pioneered the concept of damnatio memoriae. Not only would they execute you, but they would erase you from official records and forbid anyone from mentioning your name again. It was like being cancelled, but with significantly more physical dismemberment involved. Moving along our grand tour of medieval justice, let's visit the Holy Roman Empire, where they managed to make punishment both deeply religious and creatively gruesome. The German states had this charming practice called sawing, which involved hanging the condemned upside down and sawing them in half, starting from the groin. The upside-down position ensured that blood flow to the brain was maintained, keeping the victim conscious for longer than you might think possible, because efficiency was apparently less important than making sure the condemned got the full experience. German medieval courts also developed something called the Iron Maiden, although historians now think this might have been more of a Victorian invention, inspired by medieval torture devices. But they definitely had the Pair of Anguish, which was a delightful little device that could be inserted into various body openings and then expanded. Medieval German engineering at its finest. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating German punishment was called the boats, which involved trapping the condemned between two boats with only their head, hands, and feet exposed. They would then be force-fed milk and honey until they developed severe diarrhea, attracting insects that would slowly devour them alive. It was like a medieval wellness retreat, if wellness retreats were designed by people with serious anger management issues. The Germanic tribes also had this wonderful legal concept called outlawry, where instead of executing criminals, they would declare them legally dead. Outlaws had no legal protections whatsoever. Anyone could kill them without consequence. They couldn't own property, and their families were forbidden from helping them. It was like social media blocking, but with actual wolves involved. As we drift deeper into our exploration of medieval creativity in the punishment department, it's worth noting that many of these rulers weren't just randomly cruel, they were cruel with purpose. Medieval society operated on the principle that justice needed to be visible and memorable. A quick, private execution didn't serve the same social function as the elaborately choreographed public dismemberment that the entire town could discuss for months afterward. Take the case of medieval Scotland, where they developed something called hanging, drawing, and quartering specifically for cases of high treason. This wasn't just one punishment, it was a carefully orchestrated sequence of punishments designed to address different aspects of the crime. The hanging was for murder, the drawing, dragging behind horses, was for treason, and the quartering, cutting into 4 pieces, was to prevent Christian burial. It was like a medieval legal system with built-in theological consultation. Scottish medieval courts also pioneered the concept of pit and gallows. Basically, male criminals got hanged, while female criminals got drowned in specially constructed drowning pits. Because medieval gender equality meant everyone got to die, just in different ways based on their reproductive organs. But perhaps the most Scottish approach to medieval justice was the Cashielawis, which was basically trial by combat, but for entire families. If someone committed a crime, their whole clan could be challenged to a fight to the death by the victim's clan. It was like medieval reality TV, but with significantly higher stakes and much better ratings. The Scots also had this delightful practice called heading hill, where they would execute criminals on specific hills outside towns, leaving the bodies there as warnings to travellers. Over time, these hills would become literally carpeted with skulls and bones, creating a kind of medieval highway safety campaign that really grabbed your attention. Now, as we continue our gentle journey through the landscape of medieval creative punishment, let's pause to appreciate the sheer innovation involved in some of these judicial solutions. These weren't just people randomly inflicting pain, they were developing technologies, refining processes, and creating systems that would influence legal thinking for centuries. Consider the medieval concept of sanctuary, where criminals could claim protection by reaching a church or other holy ground. This led to some fascinating cat-and-mouse games where authorities couldn't technically arrest someone, but they could wait outside the sanctuary until the person either starved or gave up. It was like a medieval siege, but with more religious loopholes involved. Speaking of religious loopholes, let's drift over to the Byzantine Empire, where they managed to combine Christian theology with the kind of creative cruelty that would make a Renaissance torture artist weep with professional jealousy. The Byzantines had this fascinating approach to punishment that basically said, "We're good Christians, so we won't kill you. But we might blind you, castrate you, cut off your nose, and exile you to a monastery where you'll spend the rest of your life contemplating your sin." Emperor Basil II, who got the charming nickname Basil the Bulgar Slayer, really perfected this whole technically not murder approach to justice. After defeating the Bulgarian army at the Battle of Kleidion in 1014, Basil captured about 15,000 Bulgarian soldiers. Now a normal ruler might have just executed them or demanded ransom, but Basil was a creative problem solver. He had 99 out of every 100 prisoners completely blinded, leaving the 100th man with one eye to guide the others home. Imagine being that one-eyed guy, suddenly responsible for leading 99 blind men across medieval Bulgaria back to their families. It was like the world's most depressing game of follow the leader. The Bulgarian Tsar Samuel reportedly died of shock when he saw his army returning in this condition, which meant Basil had managed to kill an enemy ruler without actually laying a finger on him. That's some next-level psychological warfare right there. The Byzantines also pioneered something called rhinocopia, which was the delightful practice of cutting off someone's nose as punishment. This wasn't just mutilation for fun. In Byzantine society, physical deformity disqualified you from holding imperial office. So it was both punishment and permanent career sabotage rolled into one efficient procedure. Emperor Justinian II was himself a victim of this practice, getting his nose cut off during a coup, which led to him being called Justinian the Slit-Nosed for the rest of his rather unsuccessful political career. But Justinian II, bless his noseless heart, managed to regain power 10 years later and immediately set about demonstrating why giving someone a decade to nurse grudges might not be the best long-term political strategy. He had his revenge by ordering mass executions of anyone who had opposed him, often using creative methods like impaling or burning alive. One particularly memorable execution involved feeding a political opponent to wild animals in the hippodrome, because nothing says "I'm back in charge" like turning your political comeback into dinner theatre. The Byzantines also developed this charming practice called tonsure, where instead of executing rebellious clergy, they would forcibly cut off their hair and exile them to monasteries. In medieval society, this was considered worse than death because it meant spiritual and social annihilation. You weren't just removed from power, you were removed from existence in any meaningful sense. Now, while the Byzantines were busy perfecting the art of technically not killing people, let's float over to medieval China, where the imperial court had elevated punishment to something approaching high art. Chinese medieval justice operated on the principle that the punishment should not only fit the crime, but also serve as a cosmic balancing act between heaven and earth. The Chinese developed something called lingqi, often translated as death by 1,000 cuts, though the actual number of cuts was usually closer to a few hundred, depending on the severity of the crime and the skill of the executioner. This wasn't random slashing. It was a carefully choreographed process where specific body parts were removed in a predetermined order, designed to keep the victim conscious for as long as possible while teaching onlookers about the consequences of opposing imperial authority. What made Ling Chi particularly sophisticated was that it wasn't just about the physical punishment. It was about spiritual destruction. In Chinese cosmology, the body needed to be intact for proper reincarnation, so systematic dismemberment was essentially condemning someone to eternal spiritual wandering. It was like sending someone to cosmic detention for all eternity. Chinese medieval courts also had this wonderful concept called 9 familial exterminations, which meant that if you committed a serious enough crime, they wouldn't just execute you, they would execute your parents, grandparents, children, grandchildren, siblings, aunts, uncles, and pretty much anyone who had ever shared a family dinner with you. It was collective punishment taken to its logical extreme, ensuring that entire bloodlines would think twice before crossing imperial authority. The Chinese also pioneered the concept of slow slicing for different types of crimes. Political traitors might get 3,600 cuts, while murderers got fewer, and corrupt officials got a number somewhere in between, depending on how much money they had stolen. It was like a medieval legal system with built-in mathematical precision. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating Chinese punishment was called Pao Lao, which involved wrapping the condemned in wet animal hides and leaving them in the sun. As the hides dried and shrank, they would slowly crush the victim to death over several days. It was medieval engineering meets meteorology meets a really unfortunate camping trip. Moving along our tour of global medieval justice, let's visit the Islamic courts of the medieval Middle East, where they managed to combine religious law with some remarkably creative interpretations of proportional punishment. Islamic medieval justice operated on the principle of qisas, or retaliation in kind, which meant that punishments should mirror the crimes as closely as possible. This led to some fascinating legal puzzles. If someone cut off another person's hand, the punishment was to cut off the offender's hand, but which hand? The same hand or the opposite hand to create symmetry? Islamic legal scholars spent considerable time debating these questions, creating what were essentially medieval legal philosophy seminars focused on dismemberment logistics. The Abbasid caliphs were particularly creative in their approach to justice. Caliph al-Mutawakkil, who ruled in the 9th century, had this charming habit of having political opponents sewn into fresh animal hides and left in the desert sun. The hides would shrink as they dried, slowly crushing the victim while attracting every carnivorous insect within a 50-mile radius. It was like a medieval spa treatment, if spas were designed by people with serious anger management issues. But perhaps the most elaborate Islamic medieval punishment was reserved for the famous rebel leader, Baba Khorramdin, in 838 CE. After capturing him, Caliph al-Mutasim decided that a simple execution wasn't nearly creative enough for someone who had spent 20 years leading a rebellion. Instead, they developed what can only be described as a medieval torture festival. First, they cut off Babak's hands and feet. Then they impaled him on a stake, but positioned it carefully so he wouldn't die quickly. They kept him alive for several days, displaying him throughout Baghdad while he slowly died from blood loss and exposure. But the real creative touch was that they forced him to wear his own severed hands around his neck like the world's most gruesome jewelry. Medieval fashion statements don't get much more definitive than that. Islamic medieval courts also developed the concept of ta'zir, which were discretionary punishments that judges could impose for crimes not specifically mentioned in religious law. This led to some remarkably creative judicial solutions, like the judge in medieval Cairo who punished a man for public drunkenness by making him carry a pig through the city while wearing women's clothing. In Islamic society, this combined religious transgression, gender humiliation, and animal contact taboos into one efficiently devastating punishment. Now, as we drift further into our exploration of medieval judicial creativity, let's visit the Mongol Empire, where they managed to combine nomadic practicality with the kind of systematic destruction that would impress modern military strategists. The Mongols had this wonderful approach to justice that basically said, if you oppose us, we will erase not just you, but the entire concept that you ever existed. Genghis Khan and his successors developed what historians call terror as policy, which meant that punishments weren't just about individual justice. They were about sending messages that could be heard across continents. When the Mongols conquered Samarkand in 1220, they didn't just sack the city, they systematically executed the entire population, estimated at around 100,000 people, and then redirected a river to flow over the ruins so that nothing would remain to mark where the city had once stood. But the Mongols were also surprisingly creative in their individual punishments. They had this practice called the Mongolian execution, which involved wrapping the condemned in wet yak hide and leaving them in the steppes. As the hide dried and shrank, it would slowly crush the victim, but the process could take days, during which time wild animals would be attracted to the helpless person. It was like a medieval wilderness survival show, except the goal was definitely not survival. The Mongols also pioneered the concept of collective decoration. After conquering a city, they would build pyramids out of the severed heads of the defenders, creating what were essentially medieval war memorials that served as warnings to other cities about the consequences of resistance. These skull pyramids could contain thousands of heads, arranged with the kind of geometric precision that would make a medieval architect weep with professional admiration. Mongol justice also had this fascinating element of psychological warfare. When they conquered Kiev in 1240, they didn't just destroy the city, they left one building standing in the center of the ruins, containing a single survivor whose job was to tell anyone who asked exactly what had happened there. It was like having a human museum exhibit dedicated to the consequences of opposing Mongol authority. But perhaps the most creatively cruel Mongol punishment was reserved for captured enemy leaders. They had this practice called the Mongolian carpet, where they would wrap important prisoners in wet carpets and have their entire army ride over them repeatedly until the victims were slowly crushed to death. The process could take hours, and the carpets would be carefully maintained to ensure that death came slowly. It was like medieval crowd surfing, but with significantly worse outcomes for the person doing the surfing. Moving along our global tour of medieval justice, let's visit medieval Japan, where they managed to combine Zen philosophy with punishment methods that would make a medieval European torturer request a career change. Japanese medieval justice operated on the principle that punishment should be both physically devastating and spiritually instructive, creating what were essentially painful learning experiences. The Japanese developed something called sawing, which was exactly what it sounds like, but with some uniquely Japanese refinements. The condemned would be buried up to their necks, and then members of the public would take turns sawing off their heads with bamboo saws. The bamboo saws were deliberately dull, so the process would take a very long time. allowing for maximum community participation in the justice process. But the Japanese really excelled at psychological punishment. They had this practice called living burial, where criminals would be buried alive in small wooden boxes with only their heads exposed. They would be left like this for days, forced to contemplate their crimes while slowly dying of thirst and exposure. Passers-by were encouraged to mock and lecture the condemned, turning execution into a kind of interactive moral education experience. Japanese medieval courts also developed the concept of family responsibility, where if one member of a family committed a crime, the entire family would be punished. This could range from exile to execution, depending on the severity of the original crime. It was like medieval group projects, except if one person failed, everyone died. The Japanese also had this charming punishment called death by boiling, which was reserved for particularly serious crimes like counterfeiting or treason. The condemned would be slowly lowered into cauldrons of boiling water or oil, with the temperature carefully controlled to ensure maximum suffering time. Japanese medieval cooks apparently moonlighted as execution technicians, bringing their professional expertise to the justice system, but perhaps the most psychologically devastating. Japanese punishment was called crucifixion, though it was quite different from the Roman version. Japanese crucifixion involved tying the condemned to a cross and then having two spearmen stab them from both sides simultaneously, creating what was essentially synchronized execution. The timing had to be perfect, requiring considerable practice and coordination between the executioners. Now, as we continue our gentle drift through the landscape of medieval justice, it's worth pausing to appreciate how these various cultures approached the fundamental question of what punishment should accomplish. Some focused on deterrence, others on retribution, and still others on cosmic balance, but they all shared this fascinating belief that justice needed to be visible, memorable, and somehow proportional to the offense. Take medieval Islamic law, which developed incredibly sophisticated legal theories about proportional punishment. They had different categories of crimes. Hudud crimes, mentioned specifically in religious texts, Qisas crimes involving retaliation in kind, and Ta'zir crimes left to judicial discretion. Each category had its own punishment protocols, creating what was essentially a medieval legal taxonomy of suffering. The concept of eye for an eye wasn't just about revenge, it was about maintaining cosmic balance. If someone stole a loaf of bread, cutting off their hand restored equilibrium between the crime and the punishment. If someone committed adultery, stoning them to death balanced the scales between sin and consequence. It was medieval legal philosophy meets cosmic accounting. But the really fascinating aspect of medieval justice was how it combined individual punishment with social theatre. These weren't private affairs conducted in closed courtrooms. They were public events that served multiple social functions simultaneously. They entertained the masses, reinforced social hierarchies, demonstrated royal power, and provided moral instruction all at the same time. Consider the medieval European practice of drawing and quartering, which wasn't just about killing traitors, it was about putting on a show that would be discussed in taverns for months afterward. The condemned would be dragged through the streets on a sledge, hanged until almost dead, disemboweled while still conscious, beheaded, and then cut into quarters that would be displayed in different parts of the city. It was like a medieval touring production of Justice the Musical, except with significantly more actual dismemberment. The social aspect of medieval punishment also created some fascinating audience participation opportunities. During public executions, spectators weren't passive observers. They were expected to cheer at appropriate moments. throw rotten vegetables at the condemned, and generally contribute to the moral lesson being demonstrated. It was like medieval interactive theatre, but with real death involved. This public participation also created some interesting economic opportunities. Vendors would set up stalls around execution sites, selling food, drink, and souvenirs to the crowds. Executioners could make extra money by selling pieces of rope used in hangings, which were believed to have magical properties. It was like medieval capitalism meeting the justice system, creating what were essentially death-themed farmers' markets. Now, as we drift deeper into our tour of medieval judicial innovation, we absolutely must visit Spain during the height of the Spanish Inquisition, where they managed to turn religious orthodoxy into what can only be described as a medieval quality control program with an extremely aggressive customer service department. The Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478 by the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, operated on the fascinating principle that the best way to save people's souls was to torture their bodies until they confessed to crimes they may or may not have committed. It was like medieval tech support, except instead of fixing your computer problems, they were fixing your spiritual problems, and the troubleshooting process involved considerably more screaming. Tomás de Torquemada, the first Grand Inquisitor, was basically the medieval equivalent of a startup founder who had discovered a new business model and was really enthusiastic about scaling it up. Under his leadership, the Inquisition developed what can only be described as a franchise torture operation, with standardized procedures, quality control metrics, and regional offices throughout Spain. The Spanish Inquisition's signature torture device was called the garrucha, or strapado, which involved tying the victim's hands behind their back, attaching them to a rope, and then hoisting them into the air before dropping them suddenly. The sudden stop would dislocate shoulders, but the real innovation was in the timing. They would leave victims hanging for precisely calculated periods to maximize pain while minimizing permanent damage that might interfere with future interrogation sessions. But the Inquisition's real masterpiece was something called the toca, or water torture, which was basically waterboarding with medieval flair. The victim would be strapped to an inclined board, have a cloth placed over their face, and then have water slowly poured over the cloth, creating the sensation of drowning without actually drowning them. It was medieval engineering meets customer retention strategy. They wanted to keep their clients alive for as long as possible to maximize information extraction. The psychological aspect of Inquisition. Torture was perhaps even more sophisticated than the physical techniques. They had these things called autos de fe, which were essentially public ceremonies where heretics would be reconciled to the church or executed, depending on their level of cooperation, during interrogation. These events were like medieval reality TV shows, complete with elaborate costumes, dramatic music, and audience participation. The condemned would be dressed in sanbenitos, which were special tunics decorated with flames and demons for those who were going to be executed, or crosses for those who had confessed and been reconciled. It was like medieval Fashion Week, except the runway led directly to a burning stake. The unrepentant heretics got two nails with upward-pointing flames, indicating they were headed to heaven via fire, while the reconciled got downward-pointing flames, suggesting they were headed toward redemption rather than incineration. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of the Spanish Inquisition was the relajado process, where confirmed heretics would be handed over to secular authorities for execution. This allowed the church to maintain that they never actually killed anyone. They just determined that people were heretics, and then let the civil authorities handle the burning part. It was like medieval legal outsourcing, with plausible deniability built right into the system. The Inquisition also pioneered the concept of posthumous trials, where they would put dead people on trial for heresy. If the deceased was found guilty, their remains would be exhumed and burned, and their property confiscated from their heirs. It was like estate planning, except in reverse, and with more grave robbing involved. Now, while the Spanish were busy industrializing religious persecution, let's float over to medieval Italy, where the various city-states had developed their own uniquely creative approaches to justice that combined Renaissance artistry with good old-fashioned medieval brutality. Take Cesare Borgia, who was essentially the medieval equivalent of a mob boss with a really good publicist and papal connections. Cesare had this charming habit of inviting his enemies to dinner parties and then having them strangled during dessert, because nothing says sophisticated dinner host like timing your murders to coincide with the wine service. But Cesare's real innovation was in what historians call theatrical execution. When he captured the conspirators who had plotted against him in 1502, he didn't just kill them, he turned their deaths into performance art. He had them brought to the town square of Senigallia on New Year's Eve, where they were strangled with silk cords in front of a cheering crowd. It was like a medieval New Year's Eve celebration, except instead of watching a ball drop, people watched necks snap. The Italian city-states also developed some fascinating variations on traditional execution methods. In medieval Florence, they had something called defenestration, which was the practice of throwing people out of very tall windows. This wasn't just random violence, it was a carefully calculated form of execution that allowed for both dramatic flair and plausible deniability, since technically the fall killed them, not the people who threw them. Venetian medieval justice had its own unique flavor, influenced by the city's maritime culture. They developed something called drowning by sack, where condemned prisoners would be sewn into leather sacks with various animals, typically a dog, a rooster, a viper, and a monkey, and then thrown into the lagoon. The idea was that the different animals would attack each other and the prisoner while everyone drowned together. It was like medieval reality TV meets marine biology, except nobody survived to tell about their experience. The Venetians also pioneered the concept of judicial galley service, where instead of executing criminals, they would sentence them to serve as galley slaves on Venetian warships. This was considered more humane than execution, though given that galley service involved being chained to an oar and rowing until you died of exhaustion or enemy action, the humanity was somewhat debatable. At least it gave criminals a chance to see the world, even if they saw it from the perspective of someone chained to a bench getting whipped by overseers. Italian medieval courts also developed the practice of civil death, where instead of actually killing someone, they would legally declare them dead while leaving them physically alive. This meant they lost all property rights, legal protections, and social connections, effectively becoming ghosts among the living. It was like being cancelled, but with legal documentation and significantly more permanent consequences. Moving along our tour of European medieval justice, let's visit medieval Poland, where they managed to combine Slavic folk traditions with Catholic theology to create some truly unique approaches to punishment. Polish medieval law operated on the principle of compositional justice, where most crimes could be resolved through payment of appropriate fines. But for really serious offences, they got remarkably creative. Polish medieval courts had this wonderful punishment called quartering by horses, which was exactly what it sounds like, but with some uniquely Polish refinements. The condemned would be tied to 4 horses facing in different directions, but instead of just letting the horses run, they would first be fed stimulants to make them more energetic. Then musicians would play loud, discordant music to frighten the horses into pulling harder. It was like medieval extreme sports, except the person in the middle definitely wasn't volunteering for the experience. The Poles also developed something called barrel execution, where the condemned would be placed in a barrel studded with nails and then rolled down a hill. The barrel would be carefully constructed so that death would come slowly, allowing maximum time for contemplation of sins and maximum entertainment for spectators. It was like medieval carnival games, but with significantly higher stakes for the participants. Polish medieval justice also had this fascinating concept called judicial duel by proxy, where if someone was too old, young or female, to fight a trial by combat, they could hire a champion to fight for them. This led to the development of professional judicial fighters who would travel from court to court, essentially making a living by beating people up in legally sanctioned circumstances. It was like medieval mixed martial arts, except the outcomes determined guilt or innocence rather than just entertainment value. But perhaps the most uniquely Polish punishment was called the Cossack execution, which involved tying the condemned to a wild horse and then releasing the horse into the forest. The victim would be dragged through trees, rocks, and undergrowth until they died, which could take hours or even days depending on the horse's route selection skills. It was like GPS navigation, except the destination was always death, and the journey was considerably more unpleasant. Now, as we continue our gentle drift through the landscape of medieval punishment, let's visit the Holy Roman Empire during the reign of some of its more creative emperors. The Holy Roman Empire, which, as Voltaire famously observed, was neither holy nor Roman, nor really much of an empire, nevertheless managed to produce some remarkably innovative approaches to justice. Emperor Frederick II, known as Stupor Mundi, or Wonder of the World, was particularly creative in his punishments. When dealing with heretics, he developed something called the Crown of Thorns execution, where condemned heretics would have specially designed metal crowns heated red hot and placed on their heads. The crowns would slowly burn through skull and brain, creating what Frederick apparently considered an appropriate metaphor for the relationship between worldly power and divine. Just as Frederick also pioneered the concept of educational execution, where punishments were designed not just to kill criminals but to teach lessons to observers. He once had a man who had spoken against imperial authority fed to wild animals in an arena, but he provided a running commentary throughout the process, explaining to the audience exactly why each stage of the punishment was theologically and politically appropriate. It was like medieval educational television, except the learning outcomes were considerably more fatal for some participants. The Holy Roman Empire also developed the practice of imperial progress punishments, where the emperor would travel from city to city, holding public trials and executions as a form of mobile entertainment. These tours were like medieval rock concerts, except instead of music, the entertainment involved watching people get creatively dismembered in accordance with imperial justice. But perhaps the most sophisticated Holy Roman Empire punishment was something called the Wheel of Imperial Justice, which was a giant wheel to which condemned criminals would be tied and then slowly rotated over various torture implements. The wheel could be stopped at different positions, allowing for a kind of medieval torture roulette, where the specific punishment would depend on where the wheel happened to stop. It was like gambling, except the house always won and The stakes were measured in screams per minute. German medieval courts within the Holy Roman Empire also developed the concept of guild justice, where different professional guilds had the right to punish members who violated trade standards. This led to some remarkably specific punishments. Bakers who sold underweight bread might have their hands burned with hot irons, while goldsmiths who used inferior metal might be forced to wear their fraudulent products while being pilloried in the town square. It was like medieval professional licensing, but with significantly more physical mutilation involved in the disciplinary process. The German states also pioneered something called shame punishments, which were designed to humiliate rather than physically harm criminals. These could include being forced to wear animal costumes while being paraded through town, or having to sit in specially designed shame chairs in public squares while passers-by were encouraged to mock and lecture them. It was like medieval social media shaming, except the platforms were actual physical platforms and the viral aspect involved real viruses from the rotten vegetables being thrown. Moving along our tour of medieval European justice, let's visit medieval England during the reigns of some of its more memorable monarchs. English medieval punishment operated on the principle that justice should be both swift and memorable, leading to the development of what historians call efficiency through intimidation. King John, famous for being forced to sign the Magna Carta and generally being considered one of England's worst kings, was particularly creative in his approach to dealing with people who annoyed him. When the wife of a debtor pleaded for mercy, John offered to forgive the debt if she would sleep with him. When she refused, he had her husband crushed to death under heavy stones, a process that took several days. It was like medieval debt collection, except the interest rates were calculated in human suffering. John also developed the practice of hostage luxury, where he would take the children of rebellious nobles as hostages, but instead of simply killing them when their parents misbehaved, he would keep them in luxurious captivity and then slowly poison them over months or years. The parents would receive regular updates on their children's declining health, creating what was essentially medieval psychological warfare through premium child care services. English medieval courts also pioneered the concept of precedent punishment, where the specific method of execution would be chosen based on previous legal decisions. This created a kind of medieval case law system, except instead of determining legal principles, the precedents determined exactly how people would be killed. It was like legal research, but with significantly more dismemberment involved in the reference materials. But perhaps the most English approach to medieval justice was the development of parliamentary punishment, where the method of execution for serious crimes would be determined by debate and vote in Parliament. This meant that condemned criminals might have their fate decided by political considerations rather than judicial ones, leading to executions that reflected current political trends rather than consistent legal principles. It was like democracy, except the voting outcomes were measured in creative ways to kill people. The English also developed something called royal pardon roulette, where the king would randomly pardon some condemned criminals while executing others, apparently based on his mood, the weather, or astrological considerations. This meant that identical crimes might result in completely different punishments depending on timing and royal whim, creating what was essentially a medieval lottery system where the prizes ranged from freedom to creative dismemberment. Now, as we drift across the Atlantic from medieval Europe, let's explore the fascinating world of Aztec justice, where they managed to combine religious devotion with punishment methods that would make even the most creative European torturer request a career change in something more peaceful, like professional warfare. The Aztec Empire operated on the principle that justice wasn't just about punishing criminals. It was about maintaining cosmic balance between the earthly realm and the gods, who apparently had very specific opinions about how human suffering should be administered. The Aztecs believed that the gods required regular offerings of human pain to keep the universe functioning properly, which led to a legal system that was essentially a theological consulting service with a very hands-on approach to customer satisfaction. Emperor Moctezuma II, who ruled the Aztec Empire at its height, developed what can only be described as a franchise system of ritualized punishment. Different crimes required different types of offerings to different gods, creating what was essentially a medieval religious bureaucracy dedicated to matching specific punishments with appropriate deities. It was like having a celestial customer service department, except the resolution process always involved someone getting their heart cut out. The Aztecs had this wonderful punishment called flaying sacrifice, which was dedicated to the god Totec, whose name literally meant "Our Lord, the Flayed One." Condemned criminals would have their skins slowly removed while they were still alive, and then priests would wear the freshly removed skin during religious ceremonies. It was like medieval fashion week, except the clothing was made from people and the runway shows involved considerably more screaming than usual. But the Aztec masterpiece of creative punishment was something called drowning sacrifice, dedicated to the rain god Tlaloc. Victims would be thrown into sacred cenotes, underwater caves, while still alive. But the real innovation was in the timing. The drowning would be carefully orchestrated to coincide with seasonal religious festivals, turning execution into a kind of theological calendar event. Children were particularly favored for these ceremonies because their tears were believed to encourage rainfall, leading to what were essentially medieval weather. Modification programs with very high human resource costs. The Aztecs also developed the concept of gladiatorial sacrifice, where condemned prisoners would be given weapons and forced to fight trained warriors in ritualized combat. However, the prisoners' weapons would be deliberately inferior, often just wooden clubs with obsidian blades against fully armed and armored warriors. It was like medieval reality TV, except the show was called So You Think You Cannot Die Horribly, and nobody ever won. Perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated Aztec punishment was called flower war capture, where instead of simply executing criminals, they would be captured during ritualized battles and then slowly prepared for sacrifice over weeks or months. During this preparation period, they would be treated as honored guests, fed the finest foods, given beautiful clothing, and even provided with temporary wives. Then, at the climactic moment, they would have their hearts cut out on temple pyramids while still conscious. It was like the world's most elaborate dinner party, except dessert was always human sacrifice. Moving along our global tour of medieval justice innovation, let's visit the Inca Empire, where they managed to combine Andean mountain culture with administrative efficiency to create what historians call bureaucratic brutality, a punishment system so well organized it could have served as a model for modern government efficiency programs. The Inca Empire operated under something called the mita system, which was essentially a labor tax that could be converted into punishment service for criminals. Instead of simply executing lawbreakers, the Incas would sentence them to serve specific terms in various imperial projects, building roads, working in mines, or serving as human sacrifices during religious festivals. It was like medieval community service, except the community projects involved significantly more death, and the service terms were generally permanent. Emperor. Wineca developed what can only be described as an industrial approach to human sacrifice. Instead of individual executions, he would organize mass sacrifice events involving hundreds of people, all carefully choreographed according to imperial administrative protocols. Different categories of criminals would be processed through different sacrifice procedures, creating what was essentially an assembly line approach to ritualized death. It was like medieval manufacturing, except the product was cosmic balance and the raw materials were human lives. The Incas also pioneered the concept of altitude punishment, where criminals would be taken to increasingly high altitudes in the Andes Mountains and left there without adequate clothing or food. The thin air, extreme cold, and lack of resources would slowly kill them, but the process could take weeks, during which time they were expected to contemplate their crimes and pray for forgiveness. It was like medieval wilderness therapy, except the therapy always ended in death, and there were no trained counselors involved. But perhaps the most uniquely Incan punishment was called bridge sacrifice, where condemned criminals would be used as human anchors for the construction of rope bridges across mountain chasms. They would be buried alive in the bridge foundations, with their bodies serving as both spiritual protection for the bridge and practical support for the engineering. It was like medieval infrastructure development meets human resources management, except the human resources were literally incorporated into the final construction project. Now, let's drift over to medieval Russia, where the various princes and tsars managed to combine Slavic folk traditions with Orthodox Christianity and Mongol administrative efficiency to create some truly unique approaches to justice that would make even experienced medieval punishment enthusiasts request a career change. Ivan the Terrible, whom we've met before, had a son named Ivan Ivanovich, who was almost as creatively cruel as his father, at least until Ivan the Terrible accidentally killed him during a family disagreement in 1581. But before his untimely death, Ivan Ivanovich developed some interesting innovations in punishment methodology, including something called boyar drowning, where rebellious nobles would be tied to heavy stones and thrown into frozen rivers during winter. The ice would be broken specifically for this purpose, creating what were essentially medieval swimming pools. With very poor survival statistics, Russian medieval courts also developed the practice of sledge punishment, where criminals would be tied to sleds and dragged behind horses through forests during winter. The sleds would be deliberately constructed to catch on tree roots and rocks, ensuring maximum trauma during transport. The journey could take days, and spectators would follow along, creating what were essentially medieval torture parades with audience participation opportunities. The Russian Orthodox Church contributed its own innovations to medieval punishment, including something called monastery imprisonment, where instead of execution, serious criminals would be locked in monastery cells and fed only bread and water until they died of malnutrition or disease. This was considered more merciful than execution because it gave criminals time to repent, though the repentance period involved slowly starving to death in complete isolation, which somewhat limited the spiritual counseling opportunities. But perhaps the most Russian approach to medieval punishment was something called winter exposure, where condemned criminals would be stripped naked and tied to posts outside during the depths of Russian winter. They would freeze to death slowly, but the process could take hours, during which time they were expected to confess their sins and beg forgiveness from God and the Tsar. It was like medieval outdoor confession, except the confessional booth was the entire Russian winter, and the absolution process always ended in death. Moving along our tour of global medieval justice, let's visit medieval Ethiopia, where the various emperors managed to combine Christian theology with traditional African punishment methods to create some remarkably sophisticated approaches to justice that impressed even experienced medieval diplomats. Emperor Zara Yacob, who ruled in the 15th century, developed what historians call theological punishment, where different crimes were matched with specific biblical punishments adapted for Ethiopian conditions. Adulterers might be stoned to death like in the Old Testament, but using special stones blessed by Ethiopian Orthodox priests. Thieves might have their hands cut off, but the cutting would be performed during religious ceremonies designed to save their souls while destroying their bodies. Ethiopian medieval justice also had this fascinating concept called lion judgment, where serious criminals would be thrown into pits with live lions. However, if the lions refused to eat the condemned person, this was taken as a sign of divine intervention, and they would be pardoned. It was like medieval trial by animal, except the jury was composed of large carnivorous cats with very specific dietary preferences. The Ethiopians also developed something called cliff sacrifice, where condemned criminals would be taken to sacred cliffs and given the choice between being thrown off immediately or being slowly lowered down the cliff face over several days. Most chose the immediate option, but those who chose the slow death were provided with water and food during their descent, creating what was essentially a vertical death row with catering services. But perhaps the most uniquely Ethiopian punishment was called hyena feeding, where criminals would be staked out in areas known to be frequented by hyenas and left there overnight. If they survived until morning, they would be pardoned, but survival rates were approximately 0%. It was like medieval camping, except the wildlife was specifically selected for their human-eating capabilities, and there were no tents or bug spray available. Now, as we continue our gentle drift through the global landscape of medieval punishment innovation, let's visit the Khmer Empire in what is now Cambodia, where they managed to combine Hindu theology with tropical engineering to create some remarkably sophisticated approaches to creative justice. The Khmer Empire, builders of Angkor Wat, operated on the principle that punishment should reflect cosmic justice as outlined in Hindu scripture, but adapted for the specific challenges of ruling a tropical empire with access to some very interesting local wildlife. King Jayavarman VII, who ruled in the late 12th century, developed what can only be described as a theological zoo approach to punishment, where different animals were assigned to punish different types of crimes according to their symbolic significance in Hindu cosmology. Crocodile punishment was reserved for the most serious crimes. Condemned criminals would be tied to posts in crocodile-infested waters and left there until the crocodiles decided to investigate. The Khmer believed that crocodiles were sacred animals who could judge the guilt or innocence of humans. So if someone was eaten quickly, it meant they were definitely guilty, while if the crocodiles ignored them, it suggested divine intervention. Of course, starving crocodiles rarely showed much theological sophistication in their dietary choices, so the pardon rate was approximately 0. The Khmer also developed something called elephant trampling, which was exactly what it sounds like, but with some uniquely Khmer refinements. Condemned criminals would be tied to the ground in front of trained war elephants, who would then slowly walk over them. However, the elephants were trained to step very carefully, crushing specific body parts in a predetermined sequence designed to maximize suffering time while teaching theological lessons to observers. It was like medieval educational theatre, except the props were live elephants and the actors never survived the final scene. But perhaps the most Sophisticated Khmer punishment was called temple construction sacrifice, where condemned criminals would be incorporated into the construction of religious temples as both spiritual offerings and practical building materials. They would be buried alive in temple foundations, with their bodies serving as both protection for the structure and atonement for their crimes. Angkor Wat itself may contain hundreds of such sacrificial victims, making it not just an architectural masterpiece, but also a massive medieval cemetery with really impressive landscaping. The Khmer also pioneered the concept of monsoon punishment, where executions would be timed to coincide with the seasonal monsoon rains. Criminals would be staked out in low-lying areas just before the rains began, and then slowly drowned as the water level rose over days or weeks. It was like medieval weather prediction meets execution scheduling, except the meteorologists were also serving as executioners, and the forecast was always fatal. Moving along our global tour, let's visit medieval Mali, where the various Mansars, emperors, managed to combine Islamic law with traditional West African justice systems to create some remarkably creative approaches to punishment that impressed even experienced medieval travelers like Ibn Battuta. Mansa Musa, famous for his incredibly wealth-flaunting pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, also developed some innovative approaches to justice that reflected his empire's unique position at the crossroads of African traditional culture and Islamic law. He created what historians call gold punishment, where the severity of punishment was literally measured in gold weights. Different crimes had different gold weight equivalents, and punishments were designed to extract exactly that amount of suffering from the condemned. For example, theft of gold dust might be punished by having the thief's hands dipped in molten gold, creating permanent golden gloves that served as both punishment and advertisement of their crime. It was like medieval branding, except the brands were made of precious metal and the advertising campaign lasted until the victim died from gold poisoning. Malian medieval justice also had this fascinating concept called desert banishment, where instead of execution, serious criminals would be given a small amount of food and water and then abandoned in the Sahara Desert. They were technically free to go anywhere they wanted, but since everywhere they could go involved walking across several hundred miles of deadly desert, the freedom was somewhat theoretical. It was like medieval witness relocation, except nobody was relocated anywhere survivable. The Mali Empire also developed something called salt mine punishment, where criminals would be sentenced to work in the famous Taghaza salt mines until they died. The salt mines were located in one of the most hostile environments on Earth, with temperatures regularly exceeding 120 degrees Fahrenheit and no shade, water, or relief of any kind. Workers would typically survive a few months at most, making it essentially a delayed death sentence, with a very unpleasant work-study program attached. But perhaps the most uniquely Malian punishment was called caravan sacrifice, where condemned criminals would be tied to the last camel in trade caravans crossing the desert. If they could keep up with the caravan, they would be freed when the caravan reached its destination. However, the camels were deliberately loaded with extra weight and driven at maximum speed, making it virtually impossible for humans to maintain the pace. It was like medieval marathon running, except the track was the Sahara Desert, and the finish line was several hundred miles away through some of the most hostile terrain on the planet. As we continue our gentle drift through the global landscape of medieval punishment creativity, let's visit the Ottoman Empire, where they managed to combine Turkish military efficiency with Islamic legal principles and Byzantine administrative sophistication to create what historians call bureaucratized brutality, a punishment system so well organized, it could have served as a model for modern corporate restructuring. If corporate restructuring involved significantly more impaling and considerably less severance pay, the Ottoman sultans, bless their systematically cruel hearts, approached punishment the same way they approached empire building, with careful planning, attention to detail, and an impressive commitment to scalability. Sultan Mehmed II, known as the Conqueror for his capture of Constantinople in 1453, didn't just conquer cities, he conquered the entire concept of proportional punishment and rebuilt it according to Ottoman specifications. Mehmed developed what can only be described as an industrial approach to impaling that made Vlad the Impaler look like an enthusiastic amateur. The Ottomans created standardized impaling procedures with quality control metrics, training programs for executioners, and even customer satisfaction surveys from observers. Or perhaps not the surveys, but definitely the quality control part. They had specific spike sizes for different crimes, predetermined positioning protocols, and timing schedules designed to maximize both suffering duration and educational value for spectators. The Ottoman innovation wasn't just in the impaling itself, but in the logistics of mass impaling. When Mehmed conquered Constantinople, he didn't just execute the defenders, he organized them into efficient impaling queues with different processing stations for different categories of prisoners. It was like medieval assembly line manufacturing, except the product was public terror and the raw. Materials were human beings who had made the mistake of opposing Ottoman expansion plans, but the Ottomans really excelled at what historians call creative drowning. They had access to the Bosphorus, the Golden Horn and the Sea of Marmara, giving them multiple drowning venues with different atmospheric settings for different occasions. Simple criminals might be thrown into the Bosphorus with weights tied to their feet, but important political prisoners got the full Golden Horn treatment. They would be sewn into weighted sacks with various animals and thrown into the water during elaborate ceremonies attended by the Sultan himself. The animal selection for drowning sacks was apparently governed by complex theological and practical considerations. Snakes represented treachery, so traitors got snakes. Wild boars represented stubbornness, so rebels got boars. Roosters represented pride, so arrogant officials got roosters. It was like medieval aromatherapy, except instead of essential oils, they used live animals, and instead of relaxation, the goal was ritualized aquatic death. Ottoman sultans also developed something called garden punishment, which sounds lovely until you learn that it involved burying condemned prisoners up to their necks in the palace gardens and then using their heads as living lawn decorations during court festivities. Guests would be encouraged to mock and lecture the buried criminals between courses, turning execution into interactive dinner entertainment. The heads would be kept alive with carefully measured food and water portions, allowing the punishment to continue for weeks while maintaining the aesthetic appeal of the palace landscaping. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, who ruled during the Ottoman Empire's golden age, elevated punishment to what can only be described as performance art with educational components. He developed the concept of progressive execution, where condemned criminals would experience a series of increasingly severe punishments over several days, with each stage designed to teach specific moral lessons to observers. A typical progressive execution might begin with public humiliation, progress through various forms of physical torture, and culminate in death by a method specifically chosen to reflect the nature of the original crime. The entire sequence would be accompanied by religious commentary from Islamic scholars, turning execution into a kind of theological seminar with very high stakes for some participants. But perhaps the most Ottoman approach to punishment was something called Janissary discipline, where elite Ottoman soldiers who violated military code would be executed by their own unit members using traditional Janissary weapons. This created a kind of military justice peer review system, except the peer review process always ended with someone getting strangled with a silk bowstring, which was considered the most honorable form of execution in Ottoman military culture. The silk bowstring execution was actually quite sophisticated from a technical standpoint. The condemned would be seated on a low stool, and two executioners would simultaneously pull on opposite ends of a silk cord around their neck. The silk was chosen because it was strong enough to ensure quick death, but smooth enough to avoid leaving marks that might detract from the dignity of the proceedings. It was like medieval quality control meets fashion accessories meets capital punishment. Now, let's drift eastward to medieval Korea, where the various dynasties managed to combine Confucian administrative principles with traditional Korean shamanism to create some remarkably systematic approaches to justice that impressed even Chinese imperial observers, who were generally quite difficult to impress when it came to creative brutality. The Korean Goryeo dynasty, which ruled from 918 to 1392, developed what historians call seasonal punishment, where different execution methods were used depending on the time of year and the cosmic significance of various dates. Spring executions might involve burial alive to symbolize new growth, while winter executions might involve freezing to death to represent the natural cycle of death and rebirth. Korean medieval courts had this fascinating punishment called ancestral shaming, where instead of just executing criminals, they would also destroy all records of the criminal's family lineage, effectively erasing their ancestors from official history. In Confucian society, this was considered worse than death because it meant spiritual annihilation, not just for the criminal, but for all their deceased relatives. It was like medieval identity theft, except the theft was retroactive and involved entire family trees. The Koreans also developed something called bridge execution, where condemned criminals would be tied to bridges during the monsoon season and left there as the water level rose. The rising water would slowly drown them, but the process could take days, during which time they were expected to compose death poems that would be recorded by court officials. It was like medieval poetry workshops, except the workshop always ended in death, and the creative writing prompts were provided by rising flood waters. But perhaps the most uniquely Korean punishment was called mountain exposure, where criminals would be taken to sacred mountains and left there with minimal clothing during winter. They were technically free to leave, but the mountains were considered so sacred that leaving without permission from the mountain spirits would bring curses upon their families. Most chose to freeze to death rather than risk cursing their relatives, creating what was essentially honor system execution program with built-in spiritual enforcement. Korean medieval justice also had this wonderful concept called shame bell punishment, where minor criminals would be required to wear large bronze bells around their necks for specified periods, announcing their presence and their crimes to everyone within hearing distance. The bells were tuned to create discordant sounds when the wearer moved, ensuring that they couldn't blend into crowds or move silently. It was like medieval GPS tracking, except the tracking was audio-based, and the privacy violations were intentionally designed to maximize social embarrassment. Moving along our Asian tour of medieval justice, let's visit medieval Thailand, where the various kings managed to combine Theravada Buddhism with traditional Thai animism to create some remarkably sophisticated approaches to punishment that balanced the need for justice with Buddhist principles about minimizing suffering, or sort of minimizing suffering. It's complicated that the Thai approach to medieval justice operated on the principle that punishment should create positive karma for the community while allowing criminals to work off their negative karma through suffering. This led to some fascinating theological calculations about exactly how much suffering was required to balance different types of crimes, creating what was essentially a medieval spiritual accounting system with very detailed suffering to sin conversion rates. Thai medieval courts developed something called elephant trial, where serious criminals would be placed in an arena with a trained war elephant. If the elephant killed them quickly, it meant they were guilty and deserved immediate punishment. If the elephant ignored them, it suggested innocence, or at least partial innocence. If the elephant played with them before killing them, it meant their crimes were serious but not unforgivable. It was like trial by jury, except the jury was a single, very large animal with unclear legal qualifications, and the deliberation process usually involved trampling. The Thais also pioneered the concept of temple labor punishment, where instead of execution, criminals would be sentenced to work on temple construction projects until they died of exhaustion. This was considered more merciful than execution because it allowed criminals to earn merit for their next reincarnation while contributing to religious architecture. The working conditions were designed to be barely survivable, ensuring that the punishment was appropriately severe while still providing spiritual benefits. It was like medieval work-study programs, except the study was Buddhist theology, and the work was literally backbreaking. But perhaps the most Thai approach to punishment was something called river spirit judgment, where condemned criminals would be placed on small boats and sent down rivers during the rainy season. If they survived the rapids, whirlpools, and crocodiles, they would be pardoned and considered blessed by the river spirits. If they didn't survive, which was the usual outcome, their deaths would be attributed to spiritual justice rather than human execution. It was like medieval whitewater rafting, except the rafts were designed to fall apart, and the safety equipment consisted entirely of prayers. Thai medieval justice also had this fascinating concept called karma acceleration, punishment where criminals would be subjected to experiences designed to speed up their karmic consequences. A thief might have their hands slowly crushed to teach them about the pain of loss, while a liar might have their tongues slowly burned to teach them about the consequences of false speech. The punishments were carefully designed to create educational suffering that would theoretically benefit the criminal's spiritual development, assuming they survived the education process. Now let's float over to medieval Vietnam, where the various emperors managed to combine Chinese Confucian administrative principles with traditional Vietnamese animism and French colonial influences. Wait, no, that's later. Just Chinese Confucian principles with Vietnamese animism to create some remarkably bureaucratic approaches to creative punishment. Vietnamese medieval justice operated on the principle that punishment should maintain harmony between the human world and the spirit world, which required careful attention to the spiritual significance of different execution methods and their timing. The Vietnamese developed what historians call spirit-balanced punishment, where the method of execution was chosen not just based on the crime, but on the criminal's birth date, the phase of the moon, and the current relationship between various local spirits and the imperial court. This led to some remarkably complex scheduling challenges. A simple theft might require execution by drowning, but only during the third week of the lunar month when the water spirits were in the proper mood to receive criminals. Political treason might require beheading, but only when Mars was in the correct astrological position and the local ancestor spirits had been properly consulted through elaborate divination ceremonies. Vietnamese medieval courts also developed something called rice field punishment, where criminals would be buried up to their necks in flooded rice paddies during planting season. The slowly rising water would gradually drown them, but the process could take days, during which time they were expected to help with the rice planting by providing spiritual protection for the crops through their suffering. It was like medieval agricultural consulting, except the consultants were dying slowly and the agricultural advice was provided through ritualized drowning. The Vietnamese also pioneered the concept of family honor punishment, where serious criminals would be given the option of committing suicide to preserve their family's reputation, or being executed in ways that would bring shame upon their entire lineage. Most chose suicide, which was considered more honorable, but the suicide methods were carefully regulated by law. Hanging was acceptable, drowning was marginally acceptable, but poison was forbidden because it might interfere with the soul's ability to reincarnate properly. It was like medieval end-of-life counseling, except the counseling was mandatory and the life was definitely ending, regardless of the counseling outcomes. But perhaps the most Vietnamese approach to medieval punishment was something called ancestor disappointment execution, where criminals would be killed in the presence of their family ancestral tablets, with the execution method specifically designed to demonstrate how much their crimes had disappointed their dead relatives. The ancestors were presumed to be watching the proceedings from the spirit world, and their disappointment was considered part of the punishment. It was like medieval family therapy, except the family included dead people and the therapy sessions always ended with someone being executed in front of their disappointed ancestors. Vietnamese medieval justice also had this wonderful concept called seasonal spirit punishment, where different crimes required different execution methods depending on which spirits were currently active in the natural world. Spring crimes might require burial alive to appease earth spirits, while autumn crimes might require burning to satisfy fire spirits. The court employed full-time spirit consultants whose job was to track the current mood and availability of various supernatural entities for punishment purposes. It was like medieval supernatural customer service, except the customers were spirits and the service being provided was human sacrifice. As we continue our gentle drift through the global landscape of medieval punishment innovation, it's worth pausing to appreciate how these various cultures approached the fundamental challenge of making punishment both effective and meaningful. They weren't just inflicting pain randomly, they were developing sophisticated systems that integrated legal, religious, social, and even astronomical considerations into comprehensive approaches to justice. Take the medieval Islamic concept of qisas, which required that punishments mirror crimes as closely as possible. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about maintaining cosmic balance and ensuring that justice was both visible and proportional. If someone cut off another person's hand, the punishment was to cut off the offender's hand, but the cutting had to be done in exactly the same manner, using the same type of blade at the same time of day, and preferably by the same person who had been injured. It was like medieval quality control meets theological consultation meets surgical precision. This attention to detail created some fascinating legal complications. What if the original injury had been accidental? What if the victim's hand had been partially healed by the time of the trial? What if the offender's hand was larger or smaller than the victim's hand? Islamic legal scholars spent considerable time and intellectual energy working out these proportional punishment logistics, creating what were essentially medieval engineering manuals for implementing divine justice. The Chinese approach was similarly systematic, but focused more on social harmony than cosmic balance. Chinese medieval punishment was designed not just to punish criminals but to restore proper relationships within the community and demonstrate the emperor's role as the intermediary between heaven and earth. This meant that punishments needed to be educational, proportional, and visible, but also aesthetically pleasing and symbolically appropriate. Now let's drift over to some of the more creative and unusual punishment methods that medieval rulers came up with when they really wanted to make a statement, because apparently simple execution was just too boring for some of these folks. Let's start with medieval Germany, where the Holy Roman Emperors had some particularly inventive ideas about justice. Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, who ruled in the 12th century, had this charming habit of literally burying people alive in walls, not metaphorically, actually sealing them up in masonry while they were still breathing. He called it immurement, which sounds almost pleasant until you realize what it means. The person would be walled up with just enough space to stand, maybe with a small opening for food that would eventually be sealed too. Death usually took about a week. Barbarossa used this method particularly for people who betrayed trusts or broke oaths, because nothing says keep your word like the sound of someone slowly dying behind a brick wall. But Frederick wasn't content with just one creative punishment method. Oh no! He also popularized something called the lead crown, which was exactly what it sounds like. For people who got too ambitious about wanting power, he would have a crown made of molten lead and place it directly on their head. The results were immediate and final. It's like a twisted version of be careful what you wish for. You wanted a crown? Here, have a crown. Moving over to medieval Scandinavia, we find the Vikings had their own special brand of creative justice. King Erik Bloodaxe of Norway, and yes, that was actually his real nickname, not something a metal band made up, had this delightful practice called the Blood Eagle. Now, this one is genuinely horrific, so fair warning if you're trying to fall asleep. The victim would be laid face down, and their ribs would be cut away from the spine and pulled outward to resemble wings. Then the lungs would be pulled out and placed on the victim's back. Somehow, people could survive this process for a while, which was entirely the point. Erik used this method for enemies who had particularly offended him, and by all accounts he used it fairly regularly. But the Scandinavians weren't done being creative. They also had something called keel hauling, though this was more of a naval punishment. The victim would be tied to a rope and dragged under the ship's keel from one side to the other. The barnacles and rough wood would strip most of the flesh off, and if you somehow survived that, you'd probably drown anyway. It was popular among Norse sea kings who wanted to maintain discipline among their crews. Let's float over to medieval Ireland, where the Gaelic kings had their own special approaches to punishment. King Diarmait mac Murchada, try saying that 5 times fast, who ruled Leinster in the 12th century, had this practice of something called pit punishment. He would have deep pits dug and filled with various unpleasant things, sometimes snakes, sometimes just water and mud, sometimes rotting animal carcasses. People would be thrown in and left there for days or weeks. The idea was that if you survived whatever was in the pit, you'd learned your lesson. If you didn't survive, well, problem solved. Mac Murchada also liked to use something called tree punishment, where people would be tied to trees and left for the elements and wild animals. But he added his own twist. He would specifically choose trees that had symbolic meaning. Thieves might be tied to apple trees, adulterers to oak trees, and so on. It was like a very grim form of poetic justice. Now let's drift over to medieval Scotland, where the clan chiefs had some particularly Scottish approaches to punishment. Robert the Bruce, yes, that Robert the Bruce, had this charming practice called drowning by tide. Victims would be tied to posts at low tide and left to drown slowly as the water came in. But the Scottish twist was that they would often do this in full view of the victim's family and clan, making it as much about psychological torture for the witnesses as physical torture for the victim. The Scots also practiced something called burning by peat, where people would be buried up to their necks in peat bogs and left there. Peat burns very slowly and stays hot for a long time, so this was essentially slow cooking someone alive. It was considered particularly appropriate for people who had committed crimes against the clan's sacred sites or traditions. Moving over to medieval Wales, the Welsh princes had their own creative approaches to justice. Llywelyn the Great, who ruled Gwynedd in the 13th century, had this practice of something called the wooden mare. This wasn't actually a horse. It was a triangular wooden beam set up like a sawhorse. Victims would be forced to straddle it, with weights attached to their feet to increase the pressure. It would split them in half very slowly. Llywelyn used this method particularly for people who had betrayed military secrets or abandoned their posts in battle. The Welsh also had something called coracle drowning, where people would be sewn into leather boat coverings and thrown into rivers or lakes. The idea was that if God wanted you to live, the coracle would float and you might eventually be rescued. If God wanted you dead, you'd sink and drown. It was like a very grim version of trial by ordeal, except with more leather and water. Let's drift over to medieval Portugal, where the early kings had some particularly creative ideas about maritime punishment. King Denis I, who ruled in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, had this practice called shipbreaking. Pirates or naval criminals would be tied to the mast of a ship that was then deliberately run aground on rocky shores. The ship would break apart in the waves, usually taking several hours, and the person tied to the mast would experience every moment of it. Denis considered this poetic justice. You made your living from ships. Now a ship will be the death of you. The Portuguese also practiced something called salt preservation, where people would be covered in salt and left in the sun. The salt would draw out all moisture from their body while keeping them technically alive for days. It was used particularly for people who had hoarded food during famines, because nothing says learn to share like being slowly dehydrated to death. Now let's float over to medieval Hungary, where the Magyar kings had some particularly inventive approaches to punishment. King Bela IV, who ruled in the 13th century, had this practice called the iron chair. This was exactly what it sounds like, a chair made of iron that would be heated over a fire until it was red hot. Then people would be forced to sit in it. But Bela's innovation was adding restraints so people couldn't jump up and making the chair in the shape of a throne. It was his way of saying that power has its price. The Hungarians also practiced something called horse dragging with stops, where people would be tied to horses and dragged across rough terrain. But the horses would be stopped periodically to let the victim experience the full pain before continuing. It could take days to complete a journey that would normally take hours, and every moment was deliberate torture. Moving over to medieval Bohemia, the Czech kings had their own special brand of creative justice. Emperor Charles IV, who ruled in the 14th century, had this practice called the golden torture. People would be covered in honey and then covered in gold leaf, which would bond to their skin. Then they would be placed in the sun, where the gold would heat up and the honey would attract insects. It was death by literally being turned, into a precious object, which Charles found deeply ironic for people convicted of greed. Bohemians also had something called crystal punishment, where people would be forced to swallow small pieces of broken glass mixed with honey. The honey made it go down easier, but the glass would tear up their insides as it passed through. It was considered particularly appropriate for people who had spread lies or false testimony. Your words were sharp. Now let's see how you handle something actually sharp. Let's drift over to medieval Poland, where the Piast kings had some particularly Polish approaches to punishment. Casimir the Great, who ruled in the 14th century, had this practice called bear judgment. People would be thrown into pits with bears, but here's the twist. The bears would be deliberately underfed for weeks beforehand. Casimir believed that if someone was truly innocent, the bears wouldn't attack them. If they were guilty, well, the bears would take care of the problem. It was like trial by combat, except your opponent was a hungry bear. The Poles also practiced something called ice entombment, where people would be sealed inside blocks of ice during winter. They would be kept barely alive with small air holes, and the ice would be positioned so they could see their families but couldn't be reached. It was psychological torture combined with physical torture, and it could last for months if the winter was cold enough. Now let's float over to medieval Lithuania, where the Grand Dukes had some particularly pagan-influenced approaches to punishment. Gediminas, who ruled in the early 14th century, had this practice called tree marriage. People convicted of certain crimes would be tied to two trees that had been bent toward each other. When the trees were released, they would spring back to their normal positions, tearing the person in half. But Gediminas added ritual elements. The trees had to be oak trees, and the ceremony had to be performed at dawn, because apparently even brutal execution needed proper ceremony. The Lithuanians also practiced something called amber burial, where people would be buried alive but with small pieces of amber placed over their eyes and in their mouth. The amber was supposed to preserve their spirit so they could think about their crimes for eternity. It was like being mummified, except you were still alive when the process started. And as we drift deeper into the night, we can see how medieval rulers across Europe and beyond found increasingly creative ways to make punishment into both spectacle and art form, because apparently simply killing someone was just too straightforward for these folks. They needed to make a statement, send a message, and probably terrify anyone else who might be thinking about crossing them. The creativity is almost impressive in a deeply disturbing way. These weren't just punishments. They were elaborate performances designed to demonstrate power, instill fear, and create lasting memories in anyone who witnessed them. Every detail was carefully considered, from the method of death to the symbolic meaning behind it. So there we have it, more creative approaches to medieval justice from rulers who clearly had too much time on their hands and too much power at their disposal. Let's continue our gentle drift through history as we explore even more examples of how medieval rulers turned punishment into a twisted art form. Now let's drift into the religious and cultural justifications that medieval rulers used for their increasingly creative approaches to punishment, because apparently even the most brutal tyrants needed to sleep at night by convincing themselves they were doing God's work. Let's start with the concept of divine justice, which was basically the medieval equivalent of "God told me to do it." Kings across Europe developed elaborate theological justifications for their punishment methods. often with the enthusiastic support of church officials who had their own reasons for wanting to terrify the population into submission. Take King Louis IX of France, later canonized as Saint Louis, yes, a literal saint, who had some particularly creative ideas about divine punishment. Louis believed that earthly punishments should mirror the punishments that awaited sinners in hell, so he developed a whole system of what he called preview punishments. Thieves would have their hands slowly burned rather than quickly cut off, because eternal fire was supposedly worse than a quick blade. Adulterers would be slowly crushed under heavy stones because the weight of sin was supposed to be overwhelming. Louis genuinely believed he was being merciful by giving people a taste of eternal punishment so they could repent before it was too late. But Louis took this concept even further with something he called redemptive torture. The idea was that extreme physical suffering could purify the soul and actually save someone from damnation. So torture wasn't just punishment, it was a spiritual service. People were encouraged to thank their torturers for helping them achieve salvation. Louis would often visit torture sessions personally to pray with the victims and reassure them that their suffering was bringing them closer to God. The psychological impact of having a king pray for you while you were being slowly crushed to death must have been intense. Moving over to medieval England, we find that the Plantagenet kings developed their own religious justifications for creative punishment. King Edward I, known as Longshanks, had this concept of national purification. He believed that England's enemies weren't just political threats, they were spiritual contaminants that needed to be cleansed from the body of the kingdom. This is how he justified some of his more extreme punishment methods for Scottish and Welsh rebels. Edward developed something called purification by fire, where enemies would be burned alive, but the process would be stretched out over hours or days. Different parts of the body would be burned in sequence, with breaks for prayer and opportunities for the victim to confess their sins against England. Edward genuinely believed he was saving souls while defending his kingdom. The fact that this also happened to terrify his enemies was just a bonus, but Edward also created something called exemplary suffering, where punishments would be designed to teach specific lessons to specific groups. Scottish nobles would be punished in ways that mocked Scottish customs. Welsh rebels would suffer punishments that incorporated elements of Welsh law turned against them, and Irish rebels would face punishments that deliberately violated Irish cultural taboos. It wasn't just about individual punishment, it was about cultural warfare disguised as divine justice. Let's drift over to medieval Spain, where the Christian reconquest of Muslim territories created a whole new category of religiously justified punishment. The early Castilian kings developed something called conversion by ordeal, where Muslim and Jewish prisoners could theoretically save themselves by converting to Christianity, but only after surviving increasingly extreme tests of their new faith. King Alfonso VIII had this particularly twisted practice where people claiming conversion would be forced to participate in the torture of other non-Christians to prove their sincerity. If you converted to save your life, you had to help torture people who were in the same position you had just been in. It was psychological warfare disguised as religious instruction. Many people went insane from the moral conflict, which Alfonso interpreted as God testing their faith. The Spanish also developed something called heretical mirroring, where people accused of heresy would be punished using methods that supposedly reflected their specific theological errors. People who denied the Trinity would be tortured in 3 stages. People who questioned transubstantiation would be force-fed communion bread mixed with various unpleasant substances, and people who rejected clerical celibacy would face sexually humiliating punishments. It was like a twisted game of theological charades, except the stakes were life and death. Now let's float over to the Holy Roman Empire, where emperors had to justify their punishments to both temporal and spiritual authorities. This led to some particularly elaborate religious justifications for what were essentially political terror campaigns. Emperor Frederick II, the same one we met earlier, with his love of creative architecture, developed a whole theological system around the concept of imperial sanctity. He argued that the Holy Roman Emperor was God's direct representative on earth, which meant that any crime against imperial authority was literally a sin against God. This justified pretty much any punishment he could think of, as long as he could find a biblical parallel. Frederick created something called biblical reenactment, where punishments would be designed to mirror stories from the Old Testament. People who betrayed trust would face the punishment of Judas, being tied upside down until their bowels burst. People who rebelled against authority would face the punishment of Korah, being swallowed by the earth, which Frederick achieved by burying people alive in specially prepared pits. People who worshipped false gods would face the punishment of the golden calf worshippers, being forced to drink molten metal. Frederick had teams of scholars whose job was to find appropriate biblical precedents for whatever punishment he wanted to inflict. But Frederick also developed something called divine trial, endurance, where people could theoretically prove their innocence by surviving increasingly extreme ordeals. The idea was that God would protect the innocent and allow the guilty to perish. Of course, the ordeals were designed to be nearly impossible to survive, so most people died regardless of their actual guilt or innocence. Frederick would then declare that God had rendered judgment, and who was he to question divine will? Moving over to medieval Italy, the Pope himself got involved in developing religiously justified punishment methods. Pope Innocent III, who reigned in the early 13th century, created a whole system of what he called ecclesiastical correction for people who challenged church authority. Innocent developed something called spiritual surgery, where torture was described as a medical procedure designed to remove sin from the soul. Just as a doctor might amputate a diseased limb to save the body, torturers were performing spiritual amputations to save souls. The metaphor was extended in disturbing ways. Different types of sin required different types of surgery, and the process had to be carried out with the same care and precision that a doctor would use. The Church also created something called purgatorial preview, where people would experience versions of the punishments they would face in purgatory if they didn't repent. Since most people in medieval Europe believed absolutely in the reality of purgatory, this was psychologically devastating. People would be told exactly how long their punishment would last in the afterlife, thousands of years, and then be given a brief taste of what that would feel like. Many people would agree to almost anything to avoid eternal versions of what they were experiencing temporarily. Let's drift over to medieval Byzantium, where the emperors had to justify their punishments within the context of Eastern Orthodox theology, which had some different emphases from Western Christianity. Emperor Basil, the same Bulgar slayer we met earlier, developed a concept called imperial martyrdom, where he argued that carrying out extreme punishments was actually a form of suffering that he undertook for the good of the empire. He wasn't a cruel tyrant, he was a suffering servant who took on the spiritual burden of punishing sinners so that the empire could remain pure. Basil created elaborate rituals around his punishment sessions, where he would fast and pray for days beforehand, supposedly to prepare himself spiritually for the terrible duty he had to perform. He would wear special robes, carry religious symbols, and have priests bless the instruments of torture before they were used. The whole thing was designed to look like a religious ceremony, rather than a torture session. The Byzantines also developed something called theological education, where people being punished would be forced to listen to lengthy theological lectures explaining exactly why their suffering was necessary for their spiritual development. Priests would be present throughout torture sessions to provide religious instruction and to help the victim understand how their pain was part of God's plan for their salvation. It was brainwashing disguised as education, and it was often more effective than the physical torture itself. Now let's float over to medieval Hungary, where the Magyar kings had to justify their punishment methods within the context of their relatively recent conversion to Christianity. This led to some interesting combinations of pagan traditions with Christian theology. King Stephen III, who was also later canonized as a saint, developed something called conversion by demonstration, where pagan Hungarians would be forced to witness Christian-style punishments as a way of showing them the power of the Christian God. The idea was that pagan gods were weak and couldn't protect their followers, while the Christian God was strong enough to inflict terrible punishments on those who opposed him. Stephen created elaborate public spectacles where people accused of practicing pagan rituals would face punishments that were designed to mock and humiliate their former beliefs. Pagan priests would be forced to destroy their own sacred objects. People caught performing pagan rituals would be punished using Christian symbols, and entire pagan communities would be made to watch as their leaders suffered for their false beliefs. But Stephen also developed something called protective punishment, where he argued that extreme punishments were necessary to protect new Christians from falling back into paganism. People who showed any signs of reverting to pagan practices would face increasingly severe punishments, supposedly for their own spiritual protection. It was like spiritual quarantine, isolating and punishing people to prevent them from infecting others with their old beliefs. And as we drift deeper into this medieval night, we can see how rulers across Europe developed increasingly elaborate ways to convince themselves and others that their cruelest impulses were actually acts of divine service. The religious justifications weren't just cynical political covers. Many of these rulers genuinely believed that they were doing God's work by inflicting maximum suffering on their enemies. This psychological dimension adds another layer of horror to medieval punishment, because it shows how people can convince themselves that almost any atrocity is justified if they can find the right theological framework to support it. The creativity wasn't just in the methods of punishment, it was in the mental gymnastics required to make torture look like salvation. So there we have it, the religious and cultural dimensions of medieval punishment, where earthly rulers appointed themselves as agents of divine justice and found increasingly elaborate ways to make cruelty look like compassion. Let's continue our gentle drift through history as we explore more examples of how medieval justice became a twisted form of religious theatre. Now let's drift into some of the more obscure but equally creative punishment methods that medieval rulers developed in the far corners of Europe, because apparently no culture was immune to the temptation of turning cruelty into an art form. Let's start with medieval Iceland, which you might not expect to have particularly creative punishment methods given their reputation for saga writing and democratic assemblies. But the Icelandic chieftains had some uniquely Nordic approaches to justice that reflected their harsh environment and clan-based society. The practice of ice burial was particularly Icelandic in its creativity. During the long winter months, people condemned to death would be buried alive in snow and ice, but with small air holes to keep them breathing. The idea was that if they survived until spring, their punishment would be considered complete and they could rejoin society. Most people didn't survive, of course, but the few who did were often so mentally damaged by months of isolation and cold that they were never the same. The chieftains considered this a form of divine judgment. God decided who lived and who died, based on their spiritual strength. But the Icelanders also developed something called saga punishment, where people's crimes and punishments would be incorporated into the oral traditions that were so important to their culture. Your suffering wouldn't just be physical and immediate, it would become part of the permanent cultural memory, told and retold at every gathering for generations. Some people found this prospect worse than death, because it meant their shame would literally outlive them forever. Moving over to medieval Ireland, the Gaelic kings had developed some punishment methods that reflected their complex legal system and their deep connection to the natural world. The Brehon laws, which governed Irish society, included some particularly creative approaches to justice that went far beyond simple physical punishment. High King Brian Boru, who ruled in the early 11th century, had this practice called clan punishment, where entire extended families would be held responsible for the crimes of individual members. But Brian's innovation was making the punishment fit the clan's particular skills or reputation. If someone from a family of poets committed a crime, the entire family would be forbidden from composing or reciting poetry. If someone from a warrior clan committed a crime, the entire family would be stripped of their weapons and forced to work as farmers. It was a way of attacking not just individuals, but their entire cultural identity. The Irish also practiced something called sacred grove punishment, where people would be tied to trees in sacred groves and left for the spirits to deal with. But different types of crimes required different types of trees, and the positioning of the victim on the tree had specific ritual significance. It was punishment that doubled as religious ceremony, and the psychological impact of being literally offered to supernatural forces was often worse than any physical torture. Let's drift over to medieval Scotland again, where the Highland clans had developed some punishment methods that reflected their warrior culture and harsh landscape. The MacLeod clan, who controlled the Isle of Skye, had this particularly Scottish approach called mountain justice. People condemned to death would be taken to the top of high cliffs and given a choice. They could jump and die quickly, or they could be slowly lowered down the cliff face on ropes, with the rope being cut a little bit at a time. Most people chose to jump, which the MacLeods interpreted as an admission of guilt. But some people chose the slow descent, and if they somehow survived the fall when the rope was finally cut completely, they were considered innocent and freed. It was trial by ordeal with a distinctly Highland twist. The Highland clans also practiced something called blood debt extension, where punishments for crimes would be passed down through generations until the debt was considered paid. A crime committed by a grandfather might result in punishment for his grandchildren, and the specific nature of the punishment would be adjusted based on how the family had behaved in the intervening years. It was genetic justice that could span decades. Now let's float over to medieval Wales again, where the Welsh princes had developed some punishment methods that reflected their complex relationship with both English and Irish influences. Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, the last independent Welsh prince, had this practice called linguistic torture that was even more sophisticated than what we saw in Navarre. People would be forced not just to speak in English instead of Welsh, but to recite English poetry that mocked Welsh culture and history. They would have to memorize and perform songs that celebrated English victories over Wales, and they would be punished if they made any mistakes or showed any emotion while performing. It was cultural humiliation disguised as language instruction, and it was designed to break people's connection to their Welsh identity. The Welsh also developed something called ancestral shaming, where people's punishments would be designed to dishonor not just them, but their entire ancestral line. Family crests would be publicly defaced, genealogies would be altered to remove the criminal's name, and burial sites would be desecrated. The idea was that in a culture that revered ancestry, the worst punishment was to be cut off from your lineage both forward and backward in time. Moving over to medieval Cornwall, the Cornish lords had developed some punishment methods that reflected their unique position between Celtic and Anglo-Saxon cultures. The practice of tide punishment was particularly Cornish in its use of the coastal environment. People would be chained to rocks at low tide in tidal pools, with the chains positioned so that as the tide came in, they would be slowly submerged. But here's the twist. Different crimes required different tidal schedules. Minor crimes might warrant punishment during spring tides when the water rose quickly, major crimes during neap tides when the process was much slower. The condemned person would know exactly how long their drowning would take based on the tidal calendar, which added an astronomical dimension to their suffering. The Cornish also practiced something called mine punishment, where people would be lowered into abandoned tin mines and left there. The mines were dark, cold, and often partially flooded, but they weren't immediately deadly. People could survive for weeks in the mines, drinking seepage water and eating whatever small creatures they could catch. But the isolation and darkness would gradually drive them insane. It was death by gradual sensory deprivation. Let's drift over to the Isle of Man, where the Norse Gaelic kings had developed their own unique approaches to punishment that blended Scandinavian and Celtic traditions. King Godred Crovan, who ruled in the 11th century, had this practice called sea trial, where people accused of crimes would be put on small boats and sent out to sea during storm season. The boats were provisioned with just enough food and water for a few days, and they had no navigation equipment. The idea was that if the person was innocent, God would guide them to safety. If they were guilty, they would be lost at sea. Most people were never seen again, which was interpreted as divine judgment. But occasionally someone would wash up on a distant shore and eventually make their way back to the Isle of Man, and they would be considered proven innocent and restored to their full rights. The Manx also developed something called ancient law revival, where particularly serious crimes would be punished using ancient Celtic legal traditions that had been mostly abandoned. This meant that nobody really knew what to expect because the old laws were interpreted differently by different legal scholars. The uncertainty was part of the punishment. You knew you were going to suffer, but you didn't know how. Now let's float over to medieval Orkney, where the Norse Jarls had developed some punishment methods that reflected their position as both Scottish vassals and Norse rulers. The practice of winter exile was particularly suited to their northern climate. People would be stripped of all possessions and exiled from the islands during winter, when survival was nearly impossible, but they would be allowed to return if they could prove they had survived until spring. The catch was that they had to bring back proof of where they had spent the winter, which meant they had to convince someone on the Scottish mainland to shelter them despite knowing they were exiles from Orkney. It was a test of both physical endurance and social skills. The Orcadian Jarls also practiced something called saga integration, similar to what we saw in Iceland, but with a distinctly Orkney twist. Criminals' stories would be incorporated into the ongoing Orkneyinga saga, but the way their story was told would depend on how they faced their punishment. People who faced death bravely might be remembered as tragic heroes, while people who begged for mercy would be remembered as cowards forever. Moving over to medieval Shetland, the Norse influence was even stronger, and the punishment methods reflected the harsh realities of life in the far north. The practice of seal trial was uniquely Shetlandic in its use of local wildlife. People accused of certain crimes would be sewn into sealskin bags and thrown into the sea near seal colonies. The idea was that if they were innocent, the seals would recognize them as kin and protect them. If they were guilty, the seals would attack them or ignore them while they drowned. It was trial by ordeal with a marine mammal twist that could only have developed in a place where seals were a central part of daily life. The Shetlanders also developed something called peat bog preservation, where people would be buried alive in peat bogs, but positioned so that their faces remained above ground. The peat would preserve their bodies while they slowly died of exposure and dehydration, and their faces would remain visible as a warning to others. Some of these bog burials have actually been found by modern archaeologists, which is both fascinating and deeply disturbing. And as we drift deeper into this medieval night, we can see how even the most remote and seemingly civilized corners of medieval Europe developed their own creative approaches to punishment. Geography, culture, and local resources all played a role in shaping how different societies chose to make their criminals suffer. The creativity is almost anthropologically fascinating in a horrifying way. Each culture found ways to incorporate their unique environment, traditions, and values into their punishment methods. The result was a medieval world where suffering was both universal and distinctly local. These weren't just primitive brutalities, they were sophisticated, cultural expressions that revealed deep truths about how different societies understood justice, divine will, and human nature. The punishments were carefully designed to send specific messages to specific audiences, using symbols and methods that would resonate with local cultural values. So there we have it, the regional variations in medieval punishment, where even the most remote islands and mountain valleys found their own distinctive ways to turn cruelty into cultural performance. Let's continue our gentle drift through history as we explore more examples of how medieval justice reflected the unique character of different places and peoples. The legacy of these medieval punishment methods extends far beyond the Middle Ages themselves. Many of the psychological techniques developed by medieval rulers were refined and passed down through centuries of authoritarian governments. The idea that punishment should be a public spectacle, that it should send political messages, that it should break people's minds as well as their bodies. These concepts didn't disappear with the end of the medieval period. So there we have it, the final chapter in our tour of medieval punishment, where cruelty reached new heights of sophistication and became an art form in its own right. Let's drift peacefully towards sleep, leaving these dark tales behind us, but perhaps understanding a little better how human creativity can be channeled in both beautiful and terrible directions.